All right, and now we are live. And do I have a lot of things to talk about? So I'll break down the understanding of who Drake Shelton, Southern Israelite, is, what he is not, and we'll go through some of the things that have influenced him. I have studied this guy for a long time. Rick Perry has some pretty good stuff debunking this man as well. Rick Perry could also perhaps help me out as well if he wants to. So we got Toxic Angel, interesting subject matter. Interdimensional Lizard, the time has come. Rick Perry, Forge Gang, I'm still a hard man. All right, so approaching Southern Israelite Drake Shelton might appear to be hard or difficult from afar. It's because if you don't know the particular niche that Drake Shelton follows, you'll have a very difficult time understanding how he thinks. But if you just go back a bit and just kind of just do a little bit of research, actually take some time to just do a bit of reading and stuff, it becomes much easier to do. I'll show you how. I'll show you right now how you can do it. Very easy to do. What I've got here is Cannibals All or Slaves Without Masters by George Fitzhugh. 1857, George Fitzhugh. The Harmony of Interests, Agricultural, Manufacturing, and Commercial. This is by Henry C. Carey. The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. 1776. I've got The Principle of Population by Thomas Malthus, 1798. We have, yeah, that's it. The Principle of Population. This is the chapter I want to read from. An essay on the principle of population, by Thomas Malthus, again, 1798. Let me go back to page 33. I don't want to get off here. And the primary influences and teachings of the Southern Israelite are taken from Meister Eckhart. This is not someone that he was influenced by. We got Firmin Abu-Zit. Firmin Abu-Zit, who was a Calvinist. Although he was educated in the Roman Catholic faith, his parents were Huguenots. And this man's influence of being a semi-Aryan is one of Southern Israelites' influences. Another person is Samuel Rutherford. Samuel Rutherford, 1600 to 1661, Scottish Presbyterian. Nesbitt, Roxburghshire, Scotland. So those are a few of the things that Southern Israelite was influenced by. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing, and I'll break down very simply what's going on. From afar, you may feel as if it's very hard to understand that this guy seems to know so much. He's got so much knowledge and stuff because he's read books. Well, books are not that hard to read. If your heart is in the right place, you're approaching it from the correct mindset, it's not that difficult to break down who this guy is and what he does. This guy has been on the internet since at least 2013, 2012. He was a chef, or he was working to become a chef's assistant. and he was working as a bellhop. He was doing like a job being a bellhop or something, and he hurt his back. So Southern Israelite hurt his back or something. He injured his back really bad, and that's when he started to read a lot of books or something. He said that he went through like a psychological meltdown or something, and it changed him. The back pain, um, suffering, and stuff, it changed his outlook on life. His words. And it turned him essentially into the man that he is now. By 2015, he was a software engineer. He was a website designer. Yeah, that's it. Software website designer and programmer. That's where he got the background to make his own website, Southern Protestant. And in 2015, he wrote a defense of the South, or a defense against the counter-reformation of the South, which was actually a ploy that was stolen from Lewis B. Dabney's work, A Defense of Virginia and Through Her the South, which was a pro-slavery tract. And the primary person that Lewis B. Dabney was influenced from was George Fitzhugh. But the thing that you're not reading or not getting is that George Fitzhugh was Episcopalian. He actually said that it would have been better if England had stayed under the Norman influence and had discarded the Teutonic influences of the Saxons. He thought that the Norman planters were superior to the Anglo-Saxon free labor manufacturers of the South. And this is ideas that went back to The Wealth of Nations, to Adam Smith. What you're not getting is the influence of the British in this. What you're not getting is the influence of Freemasonry, the Freemasonic schools of influence, and the Hermetic influences that are coming into and influencing these things, and the change of mindset that is going on in the United States. And the fact is that from the very foundations of the 13 colonies, America was regionally divided and regionally distinct. The people that settled New England were middle class, freeholders, independent commercial people from the southeast of England, from East Anglia, from Essex, and from Sussex. That was the heartland of the Puritans, the heartland of the Pilgrims that went to Salem, Massachusetts, to Boston Bay, Massachusetts Bay Colony, to Rhode Island. Rhode Island was also a Baptist holdout. And very early on, they adopted a type of something of a hyper-Gnostic teaching. But anyways, the South was settled by people from Barbados and people from the West Country of England, as well as from the Highlands of Scotland, and from Ulster. People from Ulster settled the back country, the future Appalachian states of Tennessee and Kentucky, and the Carolinas and Georgia was settled by people from Barbados, from the West Country, from the western parts of England, from the southwest of England. Pennsylvania was settled by Quakers from the Midlands of England and Wales, and New York was settled by people that were Dutch, entrepreneurs, and so on. So already the northern states were more commercial, more progressive, and forward-looking than the southern colonies were. They were more prone to liking the British. Their elites emulated the British aristocratic model. The people in the North scoffed at the aristocratic principle. So Lyndon LaRouche has done great work somewhat about this, and he has explained that the Southern Confederacy traded with the British in the Bahamas and Canada, and they were trading cotton for material supplies, military supplies. Confederate blockade runners were being helped by the Royal Navy. And the Prime Minister Palmerston, Lord Palmerston, was going to break the Union blockade had not the royal the husband of Queen Victoria, the prince, the husband of the queen, stopped it. He stopped it in the Trent affair. And the Jesuits were backing the South. This is something that's not talked about. The Jesuits and the Knights of the Golden Circle were backing the Confederacy. If you look at the Council of Fierro, the 1819 council that the different monarchs joined, the Holy League or the Holy Alliance, they had a council in 1819 against any kind of elected Republican government. They proclaimed that they were going to oppose any kind of Republican anti-monarchy or anti-Christian government. They fought for what they perceived to be Christian monarchical government, the altar and throne, and Austria, Prussia, Tsarist Russia, Britain, all these countries agreed on a common alliance against popular uprising, popular insurgency, anti-Christian revolutionary insurgency, and also any kind of insurgency from the United States and from Latin America. So the reality is that the monarchs sided with the South because Louis Napoleon Bonaparte sent soldiers to Mexico. He overthrew Benito Juarez, the legitimately elected president of Mexico, of the United States of Mexico. He overthrew Benito Juarez and the 1855 Mexican Constitution and installed a monarch, an absolute Habsburg-style monarchy. And the Spanish were actually helping the Confederacy too. The Spanish were sending supplies from Cuba and Puerto Rico to the Confederacy. And the British were sending blockade runners. They were building in Liverpool and like the port cities in the west coast of Britain. They were aiding and helping to build ships for the Confederate Navy. Let's see here. What is a good book? Lyndon LaRouche on the Civil War. There's a lot of work that has been done about the British support for the Confederacy. But yeah, there's a lot of work and stuff that has been done about it. And not just from the LaRouche movement, not just from the Schiller Institute, not just from the Schiller Institute per se, but that's it. British support during the U.S. Civil War. Yeah, the British recognized the Confederacy as a belligerent nation, which means that they recognized its independence. And the British aristocracy, the British establishment, publicly supported the South, even though technically the British had abolished slavery. It was actually only during the Civil War that the American intellectuals like Longfellow and people like him, and British intellectuals finally broke ways and parted ways. Before the Civil War happened, American intellectuals, the American middle class, were still influenced or being greatly influenced by English norms. I know this because the inventor of the telegraph, Morse, the creator of Morse code, Theodore Morse, wrote a book in 1841 about the Jesuit Catholic infiltration of the United States government. And he was extremely pro-British and saw the British as a perfect, bright example of everything. And after the Civil War, what you see is a break of American intelligentsia, intelligentsia away from British influence. Okay, that's it. Samuel Morse, he wrote A Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the Freedom of the United States, which he was talking about the Jesuit order. After the Civil War, you see the United States become much more anti-British and much more competitive towards the British Empire. The British Empire was pushing laissez-faire economics. They were pushing the ideas of Adam Smith into the world. And when the British went into India, they destroyed all of the production plants, all of the mills, and like the things that the Hindus were using to produce their own cotton. The Hindus for thousands of years produced their own cotton, or I'm sorry, their own like linen, quilted linen and stuff, their own manufactured stuff that they did. And they had their own tools and stuff that they used to manufacture their own cloth boards. The British, when they colonized India, they destroyed all of that. And they forced the Hindus to only import English-made cloth. India became an extraction colony of the British Empire. And they kept the Hindus, billions of Hindus, poor. They kept thousands of Irish poor and backwards. And this is where the harmony of interests by Henry Carey comes into this. Because Henry Carey said that there are only two systems in this entire world. The English system, the backward barbarism, or the American system of advancement and harmony. Now, I have to say that America is no longer this example. America has been subverted, and it's probably even more involved in the deep state than the British are. But back in 1851, America wasn't quite taken over. But the primary spiritual influences of Southern Israelite is Samuel Rutherford. Samuel Rutherford and his ideology and stuff. But I need to tell you right now that Southern Israelite is influenced by Meister Eckhart and by Arius. Arius was a guy that lived in 4th century Roman Syria. And Arius believed that Jesus was not the Son of God, but he had been adopted by God. He was born of human parents. He was adopted into divinity, but he did not have his own divine nature. That's what Arius taught. And the followers of Arius were called Arians. And most of the Eastern clergy, most of the Greek Eastern clergy of the Roman Empire, they became Arians. At one point, the Bishop of Alexandria and the Bishop of Antioch were Arianists. A huge break in the Catholic Church, or the Orthodox Church, became Arian. And Arian had a huge following in the 4th and 5th centuries. A tremendous amount of the Roman Christians became Arianists, or followers of Arius. They believed that Christ was not God. They didn't believe that Jesus was God. They said that Jesus had been adopted into the divinity. They didn't believe in the Trinity. They didn't believe in any of that. And Saint Athanasius, he opposed this. He said that Jesus is equal to the Father, and both the Father and the Son are God. And the Holy Spirit speaks with its love, has love between the two, and that is the Trinity. That's the definition of the Trinity. That's why the Council of Ephesus was called by Emperor Constantine to deal with this Arian heresy, to address the problems and issues of this Arian heresy. And at Ephesus, they talked about and discussed this. That is why we have the Athanasian Creed and the Niceo-Constantinople Creed. God begets God, light begets light, true God from true God, one essence and three persons, three distinctions. It was only with Thomas Aquinas, however, that this essence and divisions of persons distinction was really fully defined. However, it took some time before that happened. But regardless, these ecumenical councils were called, and they fixed the problems with Arianism. And today, there's no more Arianists. Arianism was wiped out. It was stamped out by the state and the church working together. The hierarchy of the church destroyed and wiped out this Arian heresy. So Southern Israelite Drake Shelton has followed a Jehovah's Witness program, and this kind of Jehovah's Witness and Seventh-day Adventist mindset of appropriating Arianism. He appropriated this and now calls himself a semi-Arian. One of the things that you will hear from a lot of people that follow Drake Shelton is he is semi-Arian, semi-Arianist. And so where did he get this from? Where did he get these ideas of semi-Arianism from? A guy called Firmin Abu-Zit. A person called Firmin Abu-Zit. He lived in 18th century France. He brought this back. So this is Firmin Abu-Zit. Can you see it on the screen? Firmin Abu-Zit. He was from Uz's Kingdom of France. Man of great learning and wonderful versatility. Whatever chanced to be discussed, it is said that Abu-Zit is seemed to have made it a subject of particular study. This guy was a partial preterist, and he was a semi-Arianist. He was also an early scientist, but he was a semi-Arian and a Calvinist. He was a semi-Arian Calvinist, and this is where Drake Shelton gets his ideas of semi-Arianism. There was another sect of Arianists that went to Poland. There was another sect of Arianists that went to Poland in the 16th century. Drake Shelton has said that he is against these types of Arianists. But they created a school in Poland, and Drake Shelton has claimed that these Arianists were educated by the Jesuits, or educated by Jesuits. But the reality is that Firmin Abu-Zit, who was himself a semi-Arian, was taught by Roman Catholics. He was educated in the Roman Catholic faith. and he actually went and settled into England. And his parents were Huguenots, but he was brought up in the Roman Catholic faith because the revocation of the Edict of Nantes had happened in 1685. But he did not become Catholic. He stayed Protestant, he stayed Calvinist, and he was an early semi-Arian. And it is actually from this man's ideology, this man's semi-Arianism, that Drake Shelton got his semi-Arianism. He also got his concept of partial preterism from Firmin Abu-Zid as well. Another influence is Meister Eckhart. Eckhart von Hockheim, or just known as Meister Eckhart. One of the things that Meister Eckhart said was this, because this guy was a Gnostic. Meister Eckhart was an early Hermeticist. This is one of the things he said. There is a power in the soul which touches neither time nor flesh, flowing from the spirit, remaining in the spirit, altogether spiritual. And this was a Hermeticist attack on the immortality of the soul. This was an attack on immortality of the spirit. And the reformer Martin Luther was greatly influenced by Meister Eckhart. Martin Luther, John Calvin, and many reformers, early reformers, were influenced by Meister Eckhart. And this is another influence on that Southern Israelite has gotten. It is Hermeticist influence, a Gnostic influence. And this is also where he pulls out his concept of sympathetic magic. His concept of sympathetic magic is just a guise or a ruse to get around the fact that he has to use Platonism or Neoplatonism to describe the basics of his metaphysics. He requires Neoplatonism to describe and explain his metaphysical outlook, which he tries to claim that he doesn't use metaphysics. He says that it's pantheism. He says that instead he uses sympathetic magic. That's coming from Meister Eckhart. Another person that Southern Israelite has greatly studied and been influenced by is Samuel Rutherford. Samuel Rutherford was an extreme radical who believed in sola fides. He believed in sola fides, and he wrote a book called Lex Rex, or The Law and the Prince. And he talks about stuff against the divine right of kings. Southern Israelite is against the Anglican and Roman Catholic notion of the divine right of kings, but he isn't totally in favor of republicanism. But he's getting his ideas about law and about morality from Samuel Rutherford. And another fact that he refuses to accept, another thing that Drake refuses to accept or will refuse to admit, is that it's in fact the Protestants who actually adopted Joachimite three-age theology. The Jesuits, such as Louis de Alcazar, actually were against the Joachimite teaching. They disagreed with it. They actually disagreed with that. There was actually a church council, an ecumenical council, that was called together. I think it was the Fourth Lateran. The Fourth Lateran Council excommunicated and condemned Joachim of Fiore. Joachim of Fiore was actually almost excommunicated, or actually was excommunicated, for teaching his 3H prophecy. So the Catholic Church rejected the Joachimite model, the futurist Joachimite model. It was actually the Protestants that adopted the Joachim of Fiore 3H prophecy. Because the Jesuits at Salamanca, when they were devising and concurring their some of their projects of preterism, they actually talked about how bad or terrible Joachimite or Neo-Joachimite theology was. They were against it. Okay, here, right here. Let's see here, share screen. Yeah, here it is on Wikipedia, preterism. 1730, the Protestant and Arian Frenchman Firmin Abauzit wrote the first full preterist expedition, Asra sur l'Apocalypse. It was actually a Protestant and an Arian who first wrote a full preterist exposition. Futurism and preterism do not derive from the Catholic Church. They derive from the Protestants. Protestant historicism derives from the Joachimite school. The Protestant historicist position is from the Joachimite school of theology. Okay? The Protestant historicist position that Drake Shelton follows is from Joachim of Fiore. It's not Roman Catholic Jesuit preterism. It has nothing to do with that. Rick Perry has also discussed and talked about how absolutely foolish it is to completely abandon Christian metaphysics. You have to believe, or you have to have some type of an understanding of metaphysics. And not all metaphysics is derived from preterism. Not all of it comes from preterism. Or I'm sorry, not all of it comes from pagan antediluvian pantheism. There is a Christian metaphysical approach. It was done at the ecumenical councils. And the understanding of these metaphysics and the understanding of these metaphysical doctrines were a type of Christian metaphysics. So, here it is right here. Protestant dispensationalism is a remanufacturing of the Aeonic precessions of the ancient pagans and Gnostics. Well, there you go. The type of heresies, or the type of teachings of the Gnostics and the Hermeticists, were not completely able to get into Orthodoxy or Catholicism. Now, they did get in other ways. Like, make no mistake about it, I don't think the Catholic Church and Orthodoxy are pure, not by a long shot. They were infiltrated, but the Protestants, because they don't have a solid eschatology, they got even more infiltrated. Okay, they got even more infiltrated by pantheism and by Gnostics and Hermeticists. The Mormons are the Hermeticists of the Protestant world. The Jehovah's Witnesses, they adopted a sort of almost Arianist mindset, this Arianism. this Arian antinomian Gnosticism. The Mormons adopted a more type of Gnosticism and stuff. But yeah, it's Gnosticism. Mormonism is a revival of Gnosticism. The Jehovah's Witnesses is a revival of the Ebionites and the Judaizers and Hebrew roots. And speaking of Hebrew roots, you cannot be a Calvinist and a Judaizer. You cannot be a Judaizer and also be a Calvinist, because a true Ebionite rejects Paul. The Ebionites reject eating meat. They're against the consumption and eating of meat. And they are poor. It means the poor ones in Hebrew. They're against owning property and owning stuff. And they were primarily under James. And it was James that led the Ebionites, at least in the first years of their existence. And then Paul was against the Ebionites. Paul was against the Judaizing. You cannot follow Paul and also be a Hebrew roots person or a Judaizer. It's impossible. The Judaizers only accept the Gospel of Matthew in the Old Testament. The true Ebionite and the true Nazarene and Judaizer position is only the Gospel of Matthew and the Tanakh, or the Torah. And they're the followers of the Torah. They reject Paul. They reject everything about Paul. And Pharisaic Jesus and Inescapable Reality have talked a lot about this in depth. And they've made some pretty interesting critiques about it. But the primary thing to take away from Southern Israelite's position is he is a Malthusianist. He is a follower of a guy called Thomas Malthus. And in 1798, Thomas Malthus created an essay on depopulation. I want to talk a bit about this because you will be very surprised. As soon as you understand what Malthusian is, or what a Malthusianist is, then you'll finally understand. It all clicks together. You just have to know what Malthusianism is, and it all comes together. But I want to read chapter 5, the second or positive check to population examined in England. The true cause why the immense sum collected in England for the poor does not better their condition. The powerful tendency of the poor laws to defeat their own purpose. The positive check to population, by which I mean the check that represses an increase which is already begun, is confined chiefly through, though not perhaps solely, to the lowest orders of society. This check is not so obvious to common view as the other I have mentioned, and to prove distinctly the force and extent of its operation would require perhaps more data than we are in possession of. But I believe it has been very generally remarked by those who have attended to bills of mortality, that of the number of children who die annually, much too great a proportion belongs to those who may be supposed unable to give their offspring proper food and attention, exposed as they are occasionally to severe distress, and confined perhaps to unwholesome habitations and hard labor. This mortality among the children of the poor has been constantly taken notice of in all towns. So this is Thomas Malthus. Essay on the principle of population as it affects the future improvement of society, and remarks on the speculations of Mr. Godwin, M. Condorcet, and other writers. And this is the primary influence of the political forces behind a lot of these people. This is the philosophy behind the alt-right. This is the entire philosophy behind the alt-right and behind the Nazis, behind fascism, behind Nazism, behind all the totalitarian ideologies. It's behind all of it. This is where the racial outlook of stuff comes from. It comes from Darwinism and Thomas Malthus. Avarice and profusion. In his Inquirer, the discussion started the general question of the future improvement of society. And the author at first sat down with an intention of merely stating his thoughts to his friend upon paper in a clear masser. The essay might undoubtedly have been rendered much more complete by collection of a greater number the view which he has given of human life has a melancholy hue, but he feels that he has drawn these dark taints from a conviction that they are really in the picture, and not from a gendiced eye or an inherent spleen of disposition. The theory of mind which he has sketched in the last two chapters account to the understanding. So this is basically saying that excess populations need to die off. The excise populations of the world need to be wiped out and exterminated or enslaved. This is what Thomas Malthus proposes. If you are not economically predisposed to competition in the capitalist world, you need to get rid of breeds. You need to breed. You need to breed better people. Thomas Malthus, and this is where Edward Dutton, the jolly heretic Edward Dutton and Drake Shelton, and Mormon Shaggy and Reformed Stoic are all Malthusian. I would almost even argue that Jay Dyer's a Malthusian. All of the eugenics movement and the social Darwinian conceptions and all of that, that's Malthusianism. It means to keep the population in check, depopulate the world, create better breeds of man, build better breeds of man. That is from Thomas Malthus. A lot of the humanistic ideology and superiority ideology that Southern Israelite gets from is from Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, talked about the predominant natural selection and the Aryan Übermensch. He talks about the Übermensch and the Undermensch, the Overman and the Underman, Übermensch and Untermensch. And the Untermensch will naturally die out. They will naturally go under. The Übermensch will survive, and they will give their children to posterity. They will breed and create a better, superior man. That's Nietzsche. Nietzsche wrote in many of his tracts and essays that he was the Antichrist. In many of his books, he wrote that he is the Antichrist. He mocked Jesus, and he did not like Plato. He believed in the natural superior Obermensch, in natural selection, natural selective prowess, and better breeding tactics in Aryan colonies. Aryan breeding, that's Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche talked about the naturally intelligent and just better fit man. He wasn't so much a racist, he was just more of a product of his time. But Drake Shelton gets a lot of influence from Nietzsche. He borrows a lot of influence from Nietzsche. Another thing, too, is the Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. To understand how the Jeffersonian ideology works, to understand the differences between the states that hated slavery and those that didn't want it, and to understand the free trade and the anti-tariffs that the southern states wanted, you need to read The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. Of the nature, accumulation, and employment of stock. In that rude state of society in which there is no division of labor, in which exchanges are seldom made, and in which every man provides everything for himself, it is not necessary that any stock should be accumulated or stored beforehand. In order to carry on the business of society, every man endeavors to supply by his own industry his own occasional wants as they occur. When he is hungry, he goes to the forest to hunt. When his coat is worn out, he clothes himself with the skin of the first large animal he kills. And when his hunt begins to go to ruin, he repairs it as well as he can, with the trees and the turf that are nearest it. But when the division of labor has once been thoroughly introduced, the produce of man's own labor can supply but a very small part of his occasional wants. The far greater part of them are supplied by the produce of other men's labor, which he purchases with the produce, or what is the same thing, with the price of the produce of his own. But this purchase cannot be made till such time as the produce of his own labor has not only been completed but sold. A stock of goods of different kinds, therefore, must be stored up somewhere, sufficient to maintain him and to supply him with the materials and tools of his work, till such time at least as both these events can be brought about. A weaver cannot apply himself entirely to his peculiar business. And so it goes on, but Southern Israelites' economic ideology and Louis B. Dabney's influence is from Adam Smith, the Wealth of Nations, in which they will say that the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. It talks about the origin and use of money. It talks about real and nominal price of commodities. It talks about commodity exchange, labor and stock, wages and profit, the real value of things, etc. And that's Adam Smith. That is what is actually going on, and that's what we see here with Southern Israelite. George Fitzhugh, in his Cannibals All, Slaves Without Masters, point for point, word for word, follows exactly what Thomas Carlyle and Adam Smith say. And this is on Cannibals All, Labor, Skill, and Capital, page 33. And this is exactly the same, almost line for line, the same thing in The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. Nothing written on the subject of slavery from the time of Aristotle is worth reading until the days of the modern socialist. Nobody treating of it thought it worth while to inquire from history and statistics whether the physical and moral condition of emancipated serfs or slaves had been improved or rendered worse by emancipation. None would condescend to compare the evils of domestic slavery with the evils of liberty without property. It entered no one's head to conceive a doubt as to the actual freedom of the emancipated. The relations of capital and labor of the property holders to the non-property holders were things about which no one had thought or written. It never occurred to either the enemies or the apologists for slavery that if no one would employ the free labor, his condition was infinitely worse than that of actual slavery. Nor did it occur to them that if his wages were less than the allowance of the slave, he was less free after emancipation than before. Saint Simon, Fourier, Owen, Fanny Wright, and a few others who discovered and proclaimed that property was not only a bad master, but an intolerable one, were wicked as wicked visionaries. After the French and other revolutions in Western Europe in 1830, all men suddenly discovered that the social relations of men were false, and that social, not political revolutions were needed. Since that period, almost the whole literature of free society is but a voice proclaiming its absolute and total failure. Hence, the words of the socialists contain the true defense of slavery. Most of the active intellect of Christendom has for the last 20 years been engaged in analyzing, detecting, and exposing the existing relations of labor, skill, and capital, and in vain to rectify those relations. The philosophers of Europe who have thus been engaged have excelled all the moral philosophers that preceded them in the former part of their pursuit, but suggested nothing but puerile absurdities in the latter. Their destructive philosophy is profound, demonstrative, and unanswerable. So right there, this is a pro-slavery Southerner. This is a pro-slavery Southerner defending socialism. Okay, George Fitzhugh was influenced by Thomas Carlyle, Thomas Malthus, and Adam Smith. His economics and everything he says in Slaves Without Masters or Cannibals All is exactly line by line what is in The Wealth of Nations and in Thomas Malthus's work. This is a Malthusian approach. Drake Shelton, Southern Israelite, is a Malthusian. He is a Malthusian that supports depopulation, and he is a Nietzschean. He is a Nietzschean. And George Fitzhugh, who also was from a pro-slavery disposition and who was from Virginia, debunks Drake Shelton on all his points. George Fitzhugh debunks everything that Drake Shelton says or that Louis B. Dabney says or uses, because he says that socialism is what the South should use to retain slavery. Now, I vicariously disagree with that. I absolutely disagree with that. James says, not according to Lord Rushdoony. Rushdoony said that the South was semi-feudal. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels also talked about how the South was semi-feudal. This isn't necessarily correct because there were steamboats and railroads in the southern states. There was an industrial economy that was far more inferior to the north, but it was still present. It was a very slowly pre-industrial, but still somewhat marginally industrializing economy. It was still based upon slave labor, drawn from both the ancient world, the ancient slave mode of production, and the feudal mode of production. Karl Marx wrote a letter to Abraham Lincoln congratulating Lincoln on the anti-slavery war. And Karl Marx was writing letters for the New York Times. He was writing letters and he congratulated Lincoln. And as the American Revolution was a rebellion or an uproar of the middle classes and was drawn from the middle classes and was itself a middle class revolution, the anti-slavery war in America was likewise a working class, working men's revolution, and was given support by the working classes and the proletariat of Europe. The bourgeoisie were the ones that were the primary driving forces behind the American and French revolutions. It was the proletariat that was the driving force behind the American Civil War. Europeans were supporting the working classes, and the Civil War was a revolt of the slaves. The slaves, the black slaves of the South, were rebelling. They were resisting working for the slaveholders, and they were running or escaping up north to join in the Union Army. And at the same time, European immigrants and poor labor from Ireland and from Germany were joining in trade unions and fighting for free labor. It was a rebellion against, it was a fight between paid labor and slavery. These were the two primary systems in North America. The British were propping up the southern slave labor system and trying to use that to become the predominant force in North America so that they could divide and ostracize America from the rest of the world and open it up as a tariff-free zone for British goods and British manufactured commodities. Because if the United States doesn't industrialize, if the Confederacy does not industrialize, the British will have a monopoly on manufactured products, and they can get cotton from the South. Now, that's ultimately what has not happened. Ultimately, that's not what happened, but this is what I'm saying. Drake Shelton's idea is from Adam Smith. It's taken from Adam Smith. It is the ideas of this laissez-faire, equity-free, stock exchange-related capitalism. It is an anti-mercantilistic, laissez-faire, state hands-off, the government hands-off approach to the economy. And this is a racist, imperialist mindset. This approach is racist, okay? Adam Smith, Thomas Malthus promoted a racist, imperialist, horrendously awful Darwinian mindset. Charles Darwin's social theories and Thomas Huxley's points and stuff, Thomas Huxley and Charles Darwin, their theories of evolution and natural selection played right into this Anglo-Saxon imperialist, horrendously awful imperialist mindset. This is where Rhodes, the guy that founded Rhodesia, Rhodes, who founded the Rhodes Scholarship, and Lord Milner, who created the Milner Group, got their ideas from. There is an excess population in Britain, and they were going to have bread riots and food riots, and Rhodes said that if they export these people to the colonies, send them to Africa, send them to Asia to oppress and imperialize the indigenous peoples of Africa and Asia, and that will solve the excess population problem. That is a Malthusian mindset. That is a Malthusian concept. That is a Darwinian concept, a neo-Darwinian concept. That is in support of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. And that's exactly what happened. Another thing, too, that I want to point out, and that I need to point out, is that Southern Israelite is a Fabian Socialite. He is influenced by Fabian socialism. His ideas of theological revision and revolution are founded in Fabian socialism. H.G. Wells was a Fabian socialist, and he's a good example of this. And for over 100 years, the Anglo sphere, the Anglo world, has been deeply influenced and instinctively tied into Fabian socialism through the Tavistock Institute, through the Frankfurt School. These people are cultural Marxists. They're not economic Marxists, but they're neo-Trotskyites who later became the neocons, and they're Fabian socialists. And so this is another thing that you can use to debunk Southern Israelite. He is a Fabian socialist. He is a British intel, highly likely to be a British intel agent. He is British intel, absolute one and all British intel. He supports Albert Pike, who was a known Luciferian and wrote letters to Mazzini, the guy who was involved in Garibaldi's unification attempts of Italy in the Risorgimento. After Italy was unified, it became an imperialist nation. It invaded and terrorized Ethiopia multiple times. It invaded Ethiopia and Eritrea, and it was an imperialist power. These ideas and these concepts of Malthusianism is what drove monopolistic capitalism and imperialism, and at the same time, simultaneously supported the social liberation, feminist liberating aspects of Fabian socialism. Feminism is taken directly from Fabian socialism. I have absolutely mastered and have broken down everything step by step. Every single ideology, every single thing of Southern Israelite. I have broken Southern Israelites' worldview. I have presented it here in a compact, complete, and well explained and well thought out mindset. It is centrally, aesthetically Malthusianism. It is population control and population reduction of inferior breeds of man. It is inherently racist, it is Malthusianist, and it is Fabian socialist. It is awful. It supports the ideas of Adam Smith, and it's just ludicrous. And furthermore, George Fitzhugh, who was one of the biggest defenders of slavery, would have completely disagreed with the economic views of Drake Shelton. And Drake Shelton has never discussed or has never completely debunked Rick Perry on his Instagram or on his Facebook in regards to sympathetic magic and Neoplatonism. Drake's misconceived notion that Christianity was influenced by Neoplatonism is very probably informed by Nietzsche's misunderstanding of the same. So there's the Friedrich Nietzsche side of this. That's the Friedrich Nietzsche side of this stuff here. So I'm going to Instagram. I'm going to read some things from Rick Perry, if that's okay with Rick Perry. I'm going to read some of this stuff. I'm going to put it up on the screen too. This man is a Malthusian genocidal racist maniac, racist imperialist capitalist maniac. That's what Drake Shelton is, a neo-fascist, neo-Confederate Malthusian, genocidal Malthusian dude. Okay, there's a lot of stuff here to look through. But yeah, these economic views are just from Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. It's just Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. I found it interesting that Drake, drawing from the Lamentations of Jeremiah, opined that the West will be punished like Jerusalem was, and it was meet and just to throw in with and assist the occupation. That's Malthusianism. That's the perfect description of what Malthusian is. I can't find your work on. Yeah, I can't find your article on Friedrich Nietzsche. Yeah, I can't find your stuff on Nietzsche. I do apologize, Rick Perry, but I'm not able to find it. But I want to read Henry C. Carey's system of interests or system of harmony, because this makes perfect sense. This is my worldview right here. This is my worldview. Harmony, the harmony of interests, by Henry C. Carey, 1851. And it talks about how the southern states were just a nothing more but a client of the British Empire, representing the interests of the British Empire. And it defines and talks about the differences of the backward British system and the forwardness of the American system. The forward superiority of free labor and the practice and the rise and acquiescence of the American system. But indeed, there are two systems that predominate in the world today. It may be assumed as a universal truth that every step made in the right direction will be attended with results so beneficial as to pave the way for the further steps in the same direction, and that every one made in the wrong direction will be attended with disadvantageous results, tended to produce it necessity for a retrograde movement. The Compromise Bill in its final stages was a near approach to perfect freedom of trade, the highest duty being only 20%. I tell you what, hold on a second. Here it is.
And the other to concentration, by aid of which a market shall be made upon the land for the products, increasing the value of men to occupy desert, but written by Henry Carey. And Henry Carey, Karl Marx said he is the only American economist of any importance. And the final paragraphs of that pamphlet I will read here. Henry Carey wrote in 1851, "Two systems are before the world. One looks at exporting men to occupy desert tracts, the sovereignty of which is obtained by aid of diplomacy or war. The other to increasing the value of an immense extent of vacant land by importing men by the millions for their occupation. One looks to the centralization of wealth and power in a great commercial city that shall rival the great cities of modern times, which have been and are supported by the aid of contributions which have exhausted every nation subjected to them. And the other to concentration, by aid of which a market shall be made upon the land for the products of the land, and the farmer and the planter to be enriched. One looks to increasing the necessity of commerce, the other to increasing the power to maintain it. One looks to overworking the Hindu and sinking the rest of the world to his level, the other to raising the standards of man throughout the world to our level. One looks to pauperism, ignorance, depopulation, and barbarism, the other to increasing wealth, comfort, intelligence, combination of action, and civilization. One looks toward universal war, the other toward universal peace. One is the English system, the other we may be proud to call the American system, for it is the one ever devised, the tendency of which was elevating while equalizing the conditions of man throughout the world. And what Henry Carey was referring to was the fact that the way Britain was securing its place in the world economy was by holding back economic development. And that did not fit exactly with Marx's understanding. Marx thought that Britain colonizing India was a good thing because it would bring the free market. But as Henry Carey observed, Britain was not industrializing or making India wealthier. He did not think the British were going to India and making people wealthier. And that Britain was securing its place on the world market by holding back economic development. And then in later years of Marx's life, Marx becomes an enthusiastic supporter of the Irish people and their struggle for national liberation. Marx, this is what he writes about the Irish liberation struggle. He says, Ireland is the bulwark of the English landed aristocracy. The exploitation of that country is not only one of the main sources of their material.
Okay, so that's primarily what I wanted to get out, is that Henry Carey was right. Henry Carey exposes this fraudulent, evil, vile, destructive Adam Smith system, this doctrine and economic system that puts down billions of people in the third world, imperializes people with Malthusian practices. Thomas Malthus, Lewis B. Dabney, George Fitzhugh, and Drake Shelton are all influenced by Adam Smith's economics. It's empiricism. It is taken directly from empiricism, and it's based directly out of the philosophy of empiricism, which is John Locke's philosophy and everything else. And how ironic indeed that George Fitzhugh was extremely critical of John Locke and many of these Enlightenment thinkers, Diderot and Voltaire and Rousseau, and even Thomas Jefferson. He did not like Thomas Jefferson. That's another thing, too, about Drake Shelton. You know, he says that he's a Jeffersonian, but the fact is that George Fitzhugh and many pro slavery advocates were actually considering that maybe the slaveholders should experiment with socialism and proprietor collectivism and dish Jeffersonianism. Like, this is, you know, the Hamiltonian argument wins. Alexander Hamilton's economic model was adopted by Prussia. It was adopted by Germany because this isn't really a scientific materialist fact. This is just more me. This is more of my thinking, but I think Alexander Hamilton was more of a Germanic. I think his economic mode and his centralization was more Teutonic. It was more Germanic in its features, because the thinking of the North was more Teutonic and Germanic. The thinking and the proclivity of the southern states is Celtic. It is an offshoot of a Celtic-centered libertarianism. The offshoot of the North is centralistic and Germanic. That's just my thoughts. You can go look at God's Frontiersmen, A History of the Scotch-Irish. God's Frontiersmen, A History of the Scotch-Irish. And there's a Texas rancher in episode 3. And he talks about that the North was Anglo-Saxon, which means Germanic. That's Germanic. And he says the South was Celtic. And that was the real cultural differences that drove them apart. And this history is so lost in people's minds. Just how Germanic the North used to be. Adam Smith was Scottish. Adam Smith was not English, he was Scottish. So the Confederacy was just a Celtic output of the British Empire. It was against tariffs and stuff. But yeah, dude, Drake Shelton does not have a approachable, appropriate platform to follow. That was the entire point of why I did this stream. I conclude that Drake Shelton is a Malthusian. He is Malthusian, and he is a Fabian Socialist, which he's a supporter of the ideas of Adam Smith, laissez-faire economics of Adam Smith. Ironically, Thomas Jefferson, in a way, was actually kind of a proto-Marxist, believe it or not. You know, and George Fitzhugh would have just laughed at Drake Shelton's face. If George Fitzhugh was alive today, and Lewis B. Dabney too, they would laugh in Drake's face for being a fool. Drake Alden Shelton is a fool. He must wear the nunce hat. Drake Shelton must now wear the nunce cap because he has been scoffed at and humiliated on his academic principles. He must wear the nunce hat. What a shame. What a shame. Malthusian exposed. Racist imperialist exposed. But most of all, British intel agent exposed. Yeah, dude. Defending a Luciferian Satanist, Albert Pike, Confederate Commissioner to Indian Affairs and a friend of Sam Waddy, the Cherokee chief, in the Cherokee Indian Territory of what is now Oklahoma. a guy that had a statue put up. 33rd degree Freemason, the writer of Morals and Dogma and a correspondent to Geoffrey Mazzini, whose army invaded Sicily to try to make it part of the Kingdom of Sardinia. Yeah, dude. Real smart. So smart that you ripped off all your ideas from Meister Eckhart, from Adam Smith and Thomas Malthusian, ripped off your ideas from Joachim Fiore and who was that other guy? Abusman. Like, got your Arianist ideas from Abusman. And Arianism, Arius itself is heresy. What was his name again? It was Abusman. Okay, well, the point is that I hope you finally understand what I was getting at with this. Yeah, I hope that you finally were able to understand this. Anyways, I'm done, so we'll go through the chat. Toxic Angel says, interesting subject matter. Interdimensional Lizard says, the time has come. Rick Perry says, Forge Gang! Say it loud, say it proud. Jeem says, oh. Rick Perry says, it's like a superhero origin story. Yeah, dude, doesn't it now? It's not as if he just made it up out of his... It's not as if he just completely made it all up. No, it's got to be real. Rick Perry says, Arius was influenced by Neoplatonism, a monist, which is why his theology could not accommodate the Trinity. The Masonic project of the Jehovah's Witnesses was motivated by the geopolitical aims of the Balfour Declaration of 1917. Sebastian Moran says, there he is, a living musical genius. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Sebastian Moran says, more music, maestro. Total Jenny Dev says, sweat rub. Whoo! Rick Perry says, hands up in all them wizard sleeves. Protestant dispensationalism is a remanufacturing of the Aeonic precessions of the ancient pagans and Gnostics. Total Janny Dev says Thomas Malthus. Yeah, that was the guy that wrote about the discrepancy or the principle of depopulation. He complained that the reason why the French Revolution happened was because France had too many people that it couldn't feed itself. It couldn't feed its people, and because of that, the peasants rose up and stormed the Bastille and had a revolution. Sebastian Moran says, Britain is not Christian. It hasn't been for years. Does anyone know what it is? I'll give you a clue. It begins with T. Rick Perry says, the Masonically inspired restorationists held a full spectrum coverage of heresy, from the Judaizing in terms of monistic Neoplatonism of the JWs to the plurality of Hermeticism, re Mormonism. I would argue that Second Temple Judaism became monist before Maimonides. The Pharisees were influenced by Stoics and Sadducees Epicureans, whose doctrines were monism, materialism, and dynamism. Yeah, you've claimed that Christianity is from northern First Temple Judaism, or Israelite First Temple Judaism. Rick Perry says Drake's misconceived notion that Christianity was influenced by Neoplatonism is very probably informed by Nietzsche's misunderstanding of the same. Jean says, not according to Lord Rushduni. Rick Perry says, speaking of Thomas Carlyle, the most powerful faction within the present globalist cabals is the Carlyle Group, headed by Peter Thiel, relative of Pariah the Doll. But isn't Pariah Roman Catholic and Peter Thiel Jewish? So are you saying that Pariah the Doll is actually a Jewish convert to Catholicism? Rick Perry says, once the British lost out on the industrial race with the US, they abandoned their Girondin model and more heavily emphasized the Jacobin aspect of their dialectic. Winston Churchill. Rick Perry says, I found it interesting that Drake, drawing from the Lamentations of Jeremiah went out to the poor and the fatherless. Like Jeremiah was a socialist in his day. Virtually all the patriarchs and prophets and apostles were socialists. Like Christianity has always been against capitalism. Opined that the West will be punished like Jerusalem was, and it was meet and just to throw in with and assist the occupation. I'll send it. Ghost of Niccolo says, Forge! Rick Perry says, gang! Send it to your Instagram. Sebastian Moran says, there was really no such thing as British controlling this particular empire. The rank and file, yes. Leadership, though, I don't think so. Ghost of Nicolo says, speaking of the United Kingdom, for the record, I never have liked the Beatles, and John Lennon was a degen woman and child abuser. Well, I would agree. I mean, the Ku Klux Klan hated the Beatles. Everything that came out of the 60s, the KKK was against. Ghost of Niccolo says, I'm more of the guy who don't think they are as overrated as the Beatles. Rick Perry says that I am a hard man. Sebastian Moran says, one of the band members of The Who spent 80,000 pounds on CP, stating it was research, if I remember at the time. Talented musicians, but you know. Sebastian Moran says initials are PT just in case. Nudge wink. Dedimus Summidid says, good evening, and Rick Perry says, Pariah is a Jewish convert to Catholicism, yes. All right, so there was some more things I wanted to show right fast. Richard Brothers' 1798 book, because Drake Shelton has said that the British are successors to the kingdom of Israel. This is actually something taken from Richard Brothers' book. This is actually something that Drake does not like you to know. But yeah, Drake Shelton has said in the past that Britain, or the British people that had adhered to the Scottish Petition of Right, or the Scottish Articles of Faith, in Scotland in the 1600s, there was this compact of faith that was made by the Presbyterians. And it was a statement of faith or articles of faith. And Drake Shelton has said in the past that this means the British are the true successors to ancient Israel. He thinks the British are now God's new chosen people after the time of the Israelites or the Bible. This is an idea that he took from Richard Brothers and his 1795 book, which is called A Revealed Knowledge of the Prophecies and Times, wrote under the direction of the Lord God and published by his sacred command, it being the first sign of warning for the beneft of all nations, containing the restoration of the Hebrews to Jerusalem in the year 1798, Richard Brothers. This was one of the things that was actually one of the primary influences that led to the composition of the views of the Hebrews and the Spalding manuscript, which was which were Joseph Smith's inspirations to write the Book of Mormon. This is the beginning of the inspirations for Mormonism and for Christian identity, or British Israelitism. When I was commanded to write the chronology of the world, I was immediately after instructed by revelation how, without which I could not, nor could any other man on the face of the earth with certainty. So this is Richard Brothers' book. And Richard Brothers basically states that Britain and the Anglo-Saxons are now Israel. Drake Shelton's influence is taken from Richard Brothers' book, A Revealed Knowledge of the Prophecies and Times, by Richard Brothers, 1795. All right, now I want to read Rick Perry's thing on Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche was, I assume, in part influenced by Malthusianism, as was Sigmund Freud and a whole host of other Fabian socialists. So I want to read this as well. I want to read this from Rick Perry as well. This is important with understanding Drake Shelton too. There was nothing Nietzsche could teach you. The Trinitarian model's metaphysic theory of reality circumvents necessity and affords free agency, even in regard to deity via the person and nature distinction. On the monistic model, the cosmos isn't the product of a free choice of creation, but a consequential necessity of pure act, emanation. God being actus purus on that model. His nature and personage are conflated with each other in a fallacy of false equivalence. No person-nature distinction equals the frozen monad. The absolute unity without differentiation, the monad being juxtaposed against the necessary dialectical postulation of its diametrical opposition, division, and dispersion. The world, the problem of the one and the many, and the dialectical necessity in that paradigm for attention of analogous contraries, for existence to be a possibility. Unitarianism is just a modern rendition of monism, which, like the pagan metaphysics of the pre-Socratics, Platonists, and Neoplatonists, only serve to become a theological expression of the Enlightenment's atavistic return to paganism, which sought to dispose the Catholic Apostolic Trinitarianism, evidenced throughout the continuity of divine revelation from Genesis to the Apocalypse. And so that right there is what I wanted to also share, because that exposes the Nietzschean mindset of the superior Ubermensch that Drake Shelton tries to use. And his idea of the British as being a special people, a special nation by God, comes from Richard Brothers' 1975 book. It was an inspiration for the views of the Hebrews and for the Spalding manuscript, and they were inspirations that Joseph Smith used to write the Book of Mormon. And it was also a later inspiration that was used to create British Israelitism, which then led to the Hebrew Roots movement and to modern Judaizing. But as I already explained, you cannot be a follower of Paul and also be an Ebionite. The Ebionites only regard the Gospel of Matthew and the Tanakh to be canonical. So anyways, let's see here. Anyways, Ghost of Niccolo says, that's pretty gross, Sebastian. I don't know that. Rick Perry says, Pariah the Doll is a Jewish convert to Catholicism. Yes. Dedimus Summidid says, good evening. Sebastian Moran says, Ghost of Niccolo, it is Ghost. I think it was around 2005/2006 when the case was heard. Dedimus Summidid says, standard Anglo-Israelism/Christian identity. That's where it comes from, is Richard Brothers. Richard Brothers' book, and a book from a Huguenot immigrant to Britain in the 1730s, is The Origins of Christian Identity. Rick Perry says British Israelitism was a Proto-Hebrew roots. So yeah, the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Adventists, as well as the Pentecostals, they were used to help bring about the Balfour Declaration and the British taking the Holy Land from the Ottomans. That's all that those religions were used. It was to get the Holy Land away from the Muslims, give it to the Jews to create an imperialist, racist, apartheid Zionist state. Social, labor, Zionist, imperialist, racist, apartheid state. Israel is an apartheid state that oppresses and has killed 200,000 Palestinians in the Gaza war. The Zionists, a Zionist faction known as the Argon, or Lehi, the Argon or Lehi, the Lehi were actually fascist Axis collaborators. Yes, there were actually Jews who collaborated with the Nazis. There was a right-wing group of Zionists who openly expressed fascism. They were called the Fighters for the Freedom of Israel, and they were known as the Stern Gang. They were a paramilitary organization, and they were right-wing. They were led by Avraham Stern, and they were at war with the Irgun, or the Irgun, which is the national military organization in the land of Israel. This was a communist and pro-Soviet. Lehi was a fascist Zionist organization. It collaborated with the Axis powers. The Havara Agreement in 1938 was an agreement between Nazi Germany and the Zionist Conference. It was utilized to facilitate the founding of the State of Israel. All the neocons, all the neo-fascists, and all of the Nazis and stuff that are here today, all these so-called anti-Semites, they're Zionists. They're all Zionists. David Duke is a Christian Zionist. He just doesn't want Jews to have influence in America, but he supports Israel. He supports the murder and the death of hundreds of thousands of innocent Palestinian civilians. And 20% of Palestinians are Orthodox Christian. They're not all Muslim. So that's something that I wanted to point out. Sebastian Moran says that that's only partially true. Explain, Sebastian. According to T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, that's a British agent. That was an agent of the British Empire. The state was created by the Rots. Interdimensional Lizard says Dr. David Duke just wants to promote broccoli as a good dietary choice. He's a Zionist, Interdimensional Lizard. All of the right and the socially regressive left are Zionists. The American establishment is very pro-Zionist, and originally it was not. The America First movement in World War II was very anti-Semitic. There was a time when the American higher academic around the Ivy League was so anti-Semitic, they refused to even let Jews go into the Ivy League. They refused Catholics and Jews to go to Harvard or to join the Ivy League. It was only in the 1970s, under the Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter administration, that the United States became openly pro-Israeli. Stalin wanted Israel to be a socialist state. The Soviets and the Eastern Bloc originally supported the creation of Israel to be a socialist, a Jewish socialist state against the retrogression of the feudal Arab and capitalist Arab states. And then after the Six-Day War in 1967, they became very anti-Zionist. Sebastian Moran says, Warhammer, when did David Duke say that he supports what they do out there? What and when? Nazis are Zionists. T.E. Lawrence was murdered. They rammed him off his motorbike. Of course. Of course they did. Because he was intel and they used him. They used and they abused him. When they don't have any further use of you, they'll take you out. That's what they do. The Zionist movement is an Anglo-Saxon British op. It's an op of the British Empire and the American establishment, because the Anglo-Saxon WASP establishment on the eastern coast is reliant on and built up on British imperial money. It relies on legacy British money and funding because the elites and the aristocracy in the Northeast have direct lines to Britain. Every American president except 5 are directly related to the British royal family. Every American president besides only 5 are directly related to the British kings and queens from the Middle Ages. That's something that they never tell you. Sebastian Moran says, well, that's true. Thanks, WH. So yeah, bottom line is that Drake Shelton is a semi-Aryan. He's a Malthusian, a racist, an imperialist, a Zionist, supports a racist apartheid state in the Middle East, supports the killing and murder of innocent people in Palestine, wants to return slave labor with the Adam Smith model and Thomas Malthus's social experiments and suggestions, and the social subordination that George Fitzhugh promoted. He wants to go back to that. He wants to exploit African American labor. He wants to exploit Hispanic American labor, and he wants to enslave these people and abuse them. This is Malthusian. This is Fabian Socialist. This is evil. This is absolute evil. This is the embodiment of satanic Luciferian evil. After all, Drake Shelton, Southern Israelite, says that one of his greatest mentors was Albert Pike, a known Luciferian, corresponded with Mazzini, a known satanic Luciferian. And one of his inspirers was Thomas Jefferson, a member of the Hellfire Club and an open Satanist. In fact, Drake Shelton admits that his idol, Thomas Jefferson, was a Satanist. Drake Shelton is a Luciferian Satanist and a Malthusian imperialist capitalist swine. He is a Zionist, a racist, and an absolute sick, disgusting individual. Ghost of Niccolo says that the U.S. healthcare CEO was assassinated in New York City today, one day after Joe Biden pardoned his son Hunter Biden when he said he wasn't going to and abuse power. Sebastian Moran says Ord Wingate of the Chandits was asked to front his kith and kin out, but for some reason was murdered in a plane crash. That's very interesting. Remember Sikorsky? Are you talking about one of the presidents of Poland that died in a plane crash? Ghost of Niccolo says Drake BTFO'd. So that was my rant. We covered everything. Yeah, Drake Shelton's misunderstanding and misappropriation towards Christianity in the Bible is from Friedrich Nietzsche, or from the same conclusions that Friedrich Nietzsche got. We won. Forge Gang won. So, anyways, I am Imperator Forge. Thank you for coming by and watching. Have an awesome, fantastic Wednesday.